October 1926. Danvers, Massachusetts. 41 staff members worked the overnight rotation at Colton State Hospital for the criminally insane. Then, patient 7,741 arrived. Not in a transport vehicle like the others, in a county wagon with his wrists bound in something heavier than standard leather restraints. The driver wouldn't come inside. He left the paperwork on the front steps and didn't look back. By the third week, 4 orderlies had resigned without explanation. By the 6th week, we had stopped using Wing C altogether. This is what happened during the 42 days before the asylum superintendent ordered the permanent sealing of the lower ward. Subscribe for more historical horror stories. My name doesn't matter now. I'm 73 years old, writing this in a rented room in Providence, Rhode Island, and I have not set foot in Danvers in 47 years. What I'm setting down here is not something I've discussed, not with family. Not with the 2 people who survived the situation alongside me. We had an understanding, quiet and unspoken, that some things don't benefit from being repeated aloud. But I'm old enough now that silence feels more dangerous than speech. I arrived at Colton State Hospital in September of 1926. I was 26, recently out of work from the Brockton shoe factories, when a line supervisor told me the hospital was hiring overnight orderlies at $2.40 a day. That was real money in September of 1926. Enough to matter to a man with $12 to his name and a room to keep. The superintendent was Dr. Clarence Harwick. He was a thin man in his early 60s, with silver wire frames and a habit, I noticed it the first time and never stopped noticing it, of pressing his palms together in front of his chest when he was processing something difficult. He shook my hand, explained that 2 orderlies had recently vacated their positions for personal reasons, and showed me the intake log for Wing C. He did not mention the previous orderlies by name. The hospital held 212 patients across 4 wings at that time. Wings A and B were general population. Wing D was the women's ward. Wing C was the observation corridor. 12 cells, each with a secondary iron door bolted from the exterior for patients designated acute risk. I would be working Wing C predominantly, on the overnight rotation from 9 in the evening to 6 in the morning. The other overnight orderly on my shift was Thomas Eady, 24 years old, lanky, blonde, with a faint scar running along his chin from some disagreement he declined to explain. He had been at Coloulton 4 months and was the kind of man who talked constantly to fill silence. In a place like Wing C, you came to appreciate that quality more than you would in ordinary circumstances. The head nurse on our rotation was Margaret Hollis, stout, mid-40s, grey uniform, hair pulled back hard against her skull. She ran Wing C the way a mill foreman runs a floor, efficient, humorless, and intolerant of unnecessary noise. In 42 nights working alongside her, I heard her laugh exactly once, and it startled her as much as it startled the rest of us. Our routine was straightforward. Lights out in Wing C was 9 o'clock sharp. Thomas and I rotated checks. One of us walking the corridor every hour, the other at the desk near the Wing C entrance keeping the log current. Nurse Hollis conducted formal checks at 11 and 3. Dr. Harwick, as a rule, appeared only in the mornings. We were 9 miles from the town centre, and the road in was unpaved past the 3rd mile. In winter, the hospital was effectively self-contained. That isolation was something you adjusted to. What you did not adjust to was the particular quality of the quiet in Wing C at 2 in the morning. 41 staff for 212 patients sounds sufficient until you're standing at the far end of a corridor at 2 a.m., hearing a sound you cannot categorize, and knowing the nearest other person is 160 feet away through a set of locked doors. Patient 7741 arrived on October the 7th, 1926. I wasn't on duty that night. Thomas was, and he described it to me the next morning over tin mugs in the staff kitchen. He said the county wagon came at 10:30. 2 men brought the patient in on a wheeled chair because the patient was not walking. Not injured, Thomas said. He could see that much. Just not walking, not looking at anything in particular except the ceiling. The intake form listed the patient as male, 31 years of age, name withheld per county court order. He had been referred from Essex County Court following what the file described only as events of an extreme and unusual nature. Prior occupation was given as school teacher. No family listed as emergency contact. Medical history unremarkable until 6 weeks before admission, at which point the referring county physician had noted what he called accelerated and unexplained physiological changes. I read that phrase several times when I first saw it. I didn't fully understand what it meant. I would. The patient was assigned to cell 7 in Wing C, second from the corridor's end. Standard observation protocol, checks every 2 hours, meals through the door slot, no implements with edges. Dr. Harwick examined him the morning after admission and wrote in the record that the patient was cooperative but uncommunicative, and that his physical presentation was within acceptable parameters, though certain measurements warrant continued monitoring. That phrase, certain measurements warrant continued monitoring, I found it in the examination log 2 weeks later and read it 3 times in the corridor before I put it back where it belonged. The first week was quiet in a way that didn't feel like ordinary quiet. The patient in cell 7 ate. He slept, or appeared to. When we opened the viewing window for checks, he was usually on the cot facing the wall. He made no sound. The other 4 patients in Wing C generated enough noise between them to fill the corridor. One man recited scripture in a continuous murmur. One knocked a rhythmic pattern on his door in the small hours. The man in cell 7 was silence with a shape in it. Thomas thought he was catatonic. He'd seen catatonic patients before, he said. He said that in the first week. He stopped saying it in the second. On October 14th, exactly 1 week after admission, I was doing the midnight check alone and opened the viewing window on cell 7. The patient was not on his cot. He was standing in the center of the cell, facing the door, his arms at his sides, looking at me through the window with an expression I can only describe as patient. Not distressed, not alarmed, patient. The expression of a man who has been waiting for something specific and has recognized that the interval before it is shorter than it was. I logged it. Patient 7741, 12:03 a.m., standing unresponsive to verbal prompt, standard language. What I didn't log was that I stood at the window for close to 2 minutes before I could make myself close it, or that when I walked away, I had the clear and unambiguous sensation of being watched through the iron door from the inside. Nurse Hollis recorded the same observation at her 3 o'clock check that night. By the 3rd week of October, the patient had stopped sleeping. Not reduced sleep, stopped entirely. Every hourly check, every night, standing in the center of the cell, arms at sides, facing the door. Thomas began coming with me on my corridor checks without asking permission or giving a reason. And Nurse Hollis noticed this and permitted it without comment, which told me she'd arrived at similar conclusions through her own observations. On October 19th, Dr. Harwick conducted an extended examination of patient 7741. I was required to remain outside the cell during the examination, per protocol. What I could hear from the corridor, Dr. Harwick asking standard orientation questions. Date, name, current location. The patient answering. That was the first time I heard the patient's voice. The first time for me, and I want to be precise about what I observed. The voice was wrong. Not wrong in volume or in tone. Wrong in some more fundamental way, the way a piece of furniture placed exactly where it belongs, but facing the wrong direction, is wrong. You keep looking at it. You can't find the angle from which it resolves. I mentioned this to Thomas afterward. He said he'd heard it too, through the corridor. Dr. Harwick's notes from that examination documented that the patient showed full cognitive orientation and verbal fluency, but noted this was new to the record, that grip strength during the standard reflex test was, quote, significantly in excess of expected parameters for a man of his documented weight and prior sedentary occupation. He also noted that the patient's pupils did not respond normally to the Lampt test. Not fixed, not dilated, something else. He described it as atypical photorefractive response and underlined it twice in the margin. That same evening, Thomas found the first scratch marks. They were on the stone wall of cell 7, interior, above the height of the cot. Not the casual marks of a bored patient working at mortar. These were deep, deliberate, in clusters of 4 parallel lines, running from approximately 6 feet off the floor to, and Thomas kept coming back to this specific detail, approximately 8 feet 2 inches above the floor. He measured it using his own arm span and described it to me in the staff room the following morning with a very flat voice. The ceiling of Cell 7 was 8 feet 6 inches high. We did not discuss what that implied about whatever had produced those marks. We didn't need to. On October 23rd, Nurse Hollis submitted a formal written observation to Dr. Harwick. I didn't read the report, but she summarized it for me in the practical way she had of telling you things she determined you needed to know for operational purposes. She had been documenting changes in the patient's physical presentation across 3 consecutive weeks of daily checks. The patient's hands, she said. The proportions were changing. She said it the way she'd say the supply order was short. I looked at the patient's hands myself the next time I did the window check. He was in his standard position, center of cell, arms at sides, facing the door. His hands visible at his hips, and she was correct. The fingers were what I'll call elongated. Not grotesquely. Not in a way that would alarm a stranger encountering him once, but in a way that was unmistakable when you'd been looking every day for 3 weeks. The proportion between palm and finger length had changed definitively since admission. I held my own hand up in the lamplight afterward and compared them from memory for a long time. Around this period, other things began. Small things first, the kind you dismiss once and rationalize twice and stop sleeping over by the 3rd occurrence. The temperature in Wing C dropped measurably in the 8-day period between October the 20th and October the 28th. I know this specifically because the staff kitchen had a wall thermometer and I had begun checking it against the corridor temperature as a daily habit. Wing C ran consistently 4 to 6 degrees colder than the rest of the building during that period, with no change in external weather to account for it, and no mechanical deficiency in the furnace serving that wing. The other patients in Wing C felt it too. The scripture reciter went quiet by October 24th. The door knocker stopped knocking on the 26th. On October 26th, the patient in cell 7 spoke to me directly for the first time. I had opened the viewing window for the 2 a.m. check. He was in his usual position. And then, without any preamble, without me having said a word, he said, "You've been counting the marks." I had been. I had a private notation system in my own notebook, separate from the official log, tracking the scratch groups since Thomas first pointed them out. I said, "Which marks?" because that seemed like the appropriate response. He said, "The ones I'm making to measure." I closed the viewing window and walked to the end of the corridor and stood there for 4 full minutes before I was able to go back. When I returned, I did not open the window again. I logged patient 7741, verbal statement of unknown context, and left it at that. When I showed Thomas in the morning, he read it twice and handed the log back to me without a word. I told Nurse Hollis that afternoon. She listened, wrote it into her own notes, and said that Dr. Harwick would be informed. Dr. Harwick increased the check interval to every 30 minutes. On October the 29th, at 4:47 in the morning, the patient's cell was found unlocked, not broken, not forced. The lock mechanism was inspected immediately and found fully functional. But the door was standing 3 inches open. The patient was inside, on his cot, in what appeared to be sleep. The first time I had observed him horizontal in 12 days. The viewing window on the interior side was latched closed. That last detail, closed from the inside. Thomas examined the mechanism with both hands while I stood in the doorway. The latch required deliberate manual engagement to operate. It was not something a sedated man would close by accident, and the patient showed no indication of having been sedated. We locked the cell, woke Nurse Hollis, and had a full incident report completed and signed before 6 in the morning. Dr. Harwick arrived at 7:15 and inspected the lock mechanism personally. He then spent 20 minutes inside the cell with the patient. When he came out, he told us the lock would be inspected by a hardware specialist and that we were to add a secondary exterior bolt to the cell door in the interim. He pressed his hands together very tightly when he said it. The secondary bolt was installed November 1st. We had 3 days between the unlocked door incident and the installation, and in those 3 days the patient did not leave the cell so far as we could determine. But Wing C changed in those 3 days in ways that I have been attempting to find language for ever since. On October 30th, the 4 remaining patients in Wing C stopped eating simultaneously. Not one of them, not 2, all 4 on the same day without any possible communication between sealed cells. Nurse Hollis recorded it as coincidence. Thomas and I exchanged a look and said nothing. On October 31st, the scripture reciter, the patient in cell 9, began screaming at approximately 2:15 in the morning and did not stop until 5 a.m. Not words, not scripture, just sound, continuous and rhythmically even, like something mechanical. When we opened his cell door at 6 for morning rounds, he was seated in the corner facing the wall, knees pulled to his chest. He told the morning nurse, before going completely silent and remaining so, that the man in 7 had come to speak to him. Patient 7741's secondary bolted original locked door had been confirmed sealed every check through the night. The hardware specialist arrived November 3rd and inspected the original lock. He found it mechanically sound, no defect, no evidence of tampering. He recorded it as probable prior installation error and recommended no further action. Dr. Harwick wrote, "Lock mechanism," resolved in the incident log with a thick underline beneath the word resolved. I thought about that underline at considerable length. On November 5th, Thomas and I both heard the voice. We were at the orderly desk, which was positioned approximately 40 feet from cell 7. It was close to 1 in the morning. Thomas was filling the log, and I was reading. From the direction of cell 7, we heard not a shout and not a scream, a voice, low, measured, speaking in continuous, extended sentences. From 40 feet through an iron door, we could not make out individual words. We could hear the cadence. It was the rhythm of a lecture, the sound of a man explaining something at length to a receiving audience. We sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then we walked down together. The corridor was empty, every door sealed. The voice continued until we were approximately 10 feet from cell 7's door, and then it stopped. The patient was standing in the center of the cell, arms at his sides, facing the door. He said nothing. We logged it. Vocalization from cell 7, approximately 1:14 to 1:18 a.m. Patient uncommunicative at check. 4 minutes of speech we couldn't fully hear from a patient who didn't deny it and didn't confirm it. He simply did not respond to the question. Nurse Hollis submitted her second formal report on November 7th. I have more detail on this one because she told me directly. She had been documenting the physical changes with more clinical precision than I had understood. The patient's height had increased since admission, she was certain of it, by approximately 2 inches. This she had verified against the measurement taken at intake and recorded in the admission form. His hands she described as presenting with altered proportional dimensions inconsistent with the photographic record from October 7th. And his pupils, she paused when she told me this, which was the only time I saw Nurse Hollis pause mid-statement in 6 weeks, had changed shape. Dr. Harwick requested a second physician's consultation. The consulting physician arrived November 10th. He was in the cell with patient 7,741 for approximately 20 minutes and left without speaking to any of the Wing C staff. His written findings, which I obtained a copy of years later through a records contact, stated only that the patient exhibited anomalous physiological presentations requiring specialist consultation and recommended transfer to a facility equipped for extended neurological observation. He named no specific facility, no specialist consultation followed. The transfer was never arranged. On November the 12th, the event that changed my personal understanding of the situation occurred. I was doing the 2 a.m. check alone. Thomas was home ill with true influenza, and we were short-staffed. The wing was quiet. I did cells 9, 11, and 3 first, working towards cell 7 last. That sequence had become my habit. Without my fully acknowledging it, I was delaying the final check. When I could delay no longer, I opened the cell 7 viewing window. The cell was empty. The secondary exterior bolt was engaged, the original lock was engaged, the interior viewing window latch was open from the inside. The cell was simply empty of its occupant. I stood at that window for a duration I counted at approximately 10 seconds, and then something moved in the corridor behind me. Not beside me, in the corridor. I turned around. The corridor was empty, but the kerosene lamp I had set on the floor approximately 20 feet back at the start of the check. It had been moved. It was now sitting against the opposite wall, still burning, facing a different direction. I had not moved it. I walked to the far end of the corridor and used the emergency bell to summon Nurse Hollis. She arrived in 4 minutes. We searched Wing C together, systematically and thoroughly, every cell sealed and occupied, every exterior bolt and lock engaged. The patient in cell 7, when Hollis opened the viewing window, was in his standard position. "He wasn't there," I said. She looked at the patient through the window, looked back at me and said, "I believe you." That was the first time in my working life that I understood the difference between someone believing your account and someone being as frightened as you were. We entered a different version of events in the official log. I am not proud of that. But the official record and the actual situation had been two separate things for several weeks by then, and filing accurate reports into that gap was not helping anyone in a practical sense. November 14th, the temperature in Wing C dropped to what I measured as 38 degrees Fahrenheit at the interior desk, while the rest of the hospital maintained approximately 52. There was no structural or mechanical cause identified. The wing furnace was functional. The pipes were clear and flowing. The differential simply existed and did not resolve. That evening, the patient in cell 3, a man I had never seen display anything other than complete withdrawal since my arrival, pressed his face against his viewing window from the inside and began repeating a phrase. Thomas was back on shift and heard it first. He came to get me before going any closer to the cell. The phrase was, "It's almost ready." He repeated it with no variation in phrasing for approximately 6 hours. Then he stopped. He never spoke again during my remaining time at Colton State. On November 16th, the patient in cell 7 spoke to me for the second time. I had opened the viewing window for the 10 p.m. check. He was in his standard position, he said, without raising his voice and without preamble. "You can hear it in the walls now, can't you?" Not a question. I had, in fact, been hearing something in the walls of Wing C for approximately 3 days at that point. A low sound, rhythmic, below the register of language, which I had attributed to the pipes settling in the dropping temperature. It occurred at intervals I had begun tracking, approximately every 18 minutes. I had not recorded it in any log. I had not told Thomas or Nurse Hollis. I had told no one. "He knew," I said. "What are you?" He looked at me for a moment with those vertically elongated pupils and said, "What I have always been. You put a word to it eventually. You people always do." Then he turned around and faced the back wall of the cell and did not speak again that night. I stood at the closed viewing window for 11 minutes. I checked my watch twice to verify the duration. Then I returned to the orderly desk and wrote nothing in the log for that check at all. November 18th brought the first physical evidence outside cell 7. Thomas found marks on the 30-foot section of old wooden flooring between the orderly desk and cell 7. He called me in at the end of shift, and we looked at them together by lamplight. Indentations in the surface of the boards in a pattern consistent with movement. Long, irregular stride. We measured the distance between impressions, approximately 54 inches. An average man's walking stride is 24 to 30 inches. Nurse Hollis measured the width of each impression with a ruler from the desk. She did not speak for a long interval. Then she stood up and said she would be informing Dr. Harwick that morning. Dr. Harwick came that afternoon. He examined the marks. He said the floor was old and the impressions were the result of water damage causing irregular settling of the planks. He wrote this in the incident log. He pressed his hands together so tightly when he wrote it that his knuckles went white. That night, November 18th, running into the 19th, was the last overnight I worked in Wing C. At 11 p.m., Nurse Hollis conducted the standard formal check. All cells confirmed, occupied, and secured. She made her log entry and returned to the desk. At 11:47, I know because I looked at the clock on the desk when the sound started, we heard something from the direction of Cell 7, not a voice. Not an animal, not the rhythmic wall sound, a series of impacts against the interior of the cell door, regular, measured, not frantic. Approximately 4 seconds between each impact. Thomas and I counted them together without speaking, just mouthing the numbers. We reached 11. Then it stopped. We stood at the desk without moving for approximately 30 seconds. Then Nurse Hollis said quietly that she was going to open the viewing window and that she wanted someone with her. I said I'd come. Thomas positioned himself at the wing entrance with his back against the door. Hollis and I walked down the corridor together. She put her hand on the viewing window latch of Cell 7. I was standing at her shoulder with the lamp held high. She opened the window. The cell was empty. No patient, empty. But the lamplight came through the window and struck the far wall, and we could see clearly that the scratch marks had changed since the last documented check. The original clusters, the groups of 4 running from 6 to 8 feet, were still there, but there were new marks above them, continuing up the wall, continuing across the ceiling. The ceiling of Cell 7 was 8 feet 6 inches high. Something that produced those marks had pressed against the ceiling. Hollis closed the viewing window. She said very steadily, "We're going to wake Dr. Harwick." We woke Dr. Harwick at 10 minutes past midnight. He arrived at 12:40 in his coat over partially dressed clothing, his spectacles slightly crooked on his face. He looked through the viewing window of Cell 7 for approximately 45 seconds. Then he stepped back. He stood very still and looked at the corridor floor. Then he did something I had not seen him do in the 6 weeks I had worked under him. He looked at Nurse Hollis and asked what she recommended. She said, "Evacuation of Wing C tonight. Permanent sealing of Cell 7 pending full medical review. Transfer of patient 7,741 to state authority in the morning." Dr. Harwick said he would need to make the appropriate calls in the morning. Hollis said, "I understand that, but the wing needs to be cleared tonight." He looked at the corridor floor again. He looked at his own hands. Then he pressed them together and said, "Begin the transfers." We moved the 4 remaining patients from Wing C to Wings A and B between 1 and 3 in the morning. 11 staff members working, including 3 pulled from other rotations. The transfers were without incident. The scripture reciter walked on his own and did not look back toward Wing C once he crossed the threshold into the main building corridor. The patient, who had been reciting the phrase walked out of his cell, sat down on the floor at the Wing C entrance and remained seated for 20 minutes without explanation, then stood up and walked to Wing A without assistance, precisely and suddenly, as if a signal had been given. Patient 7,741 was not moved. Dr. Harwick made this decision over Nurse Hollis's written objection, noting that county authorization was required for transfer and would be secured by morning. He noted that the secondary bolt and original lock secured the cell. He noted there was no documented evidence of direct physical danger to staff. He said all of this, and Nurse Hollis wrote her objection into the formal record, and we sealed Wing C. The entrance to Wing C was exterior bolted from the main corridor. We posted no one at the entrance. Hollis and I made this decision without discussing it. We were not going to ask Thomas or any orderly to stand 40 feet from Cell 7 in an empty corridor at 3 in the morning, and we were not going to do it ourselves. I stayed at the main building orderly desk with Thomas until 6 a.m. We heard nothing from Wing C after 3 a.m. That silence, in some way I find difficult to articulate, was worse than anything that had preceded it. At 6:15, Dr. Harwick, Nurse Hollis, and I entered Wing C together for morning rounds. We walked the full corridor, every cell empty and undisturbed as we had left them. The temperature was cold enough that I could see my breath at standing height. I estimated it at the low 30s. We reached cell 7. We opened the viewing window. The cell was empty. The cot was undisturbed. The scratch marks covered 3 complete walls and the full ceiling in unbroken patterns. The air coming through the window opening was cold in a way that had nothing to do with a Massachusetts November or any November I have experienced before or since. Dr. Harwick said in a voice that was entirely level that county authorities would need to be contacted immediately. He never opened the cell door. None of us did. The county investigators arrived November 20th with 2 men in overcoats who inspected the cell, the corridor, and the grounds. Patient 7741 was not found on the property number breach in the perimeter fence was discovered. No point of external entry or exit was identified. The official investigation report noted that the patient had escaped through means currently under investigation and that the matter had been referred to state authorities. I am not aware of any state follow-up. We left Coloulton on the morning of November 21st, 1926. Not dismissed, not formally asked to leave, Nurse Hollis submitted written resignation that morning. Thomas and I did not return for the following shift, and Dr. Harwick made no attempt to contact us. I believe he understood. He filed the incident record in language that bore no relationship to anything we had experienced, and I have come to think that was probably the correct choice for the record's purposes. The walk to the county road was 8 miles. The 3 of us walked together to the first junction, and then Thomas went north and Hollis went west, and I caught the southbound bus. We had one conversation on that walk. Thomas said, "What do you think it was?" Nurse Hollis said, "Old." She did not elaborate. Neither of us asked her to. That single word seemed to contain everything that needed to be said about what we had witnessed over 42 nights in Wing C. Wing C was formally decommissioned in December 1926. The official reason given was structural integrity concerns with the original stone foundation of the observation corridor. The remainder of Colton State Hospital continued operating until 1952. What became of the Wing C patient records in their entirety, I have been unable to determine. The intake form for patient 7741, when I attempted to locate it through a records contact years later, does not appear in any surviving documentation from that institution. The official record ends where his name would have been. I'm 73 years old now, living in Providence since 1927. I worked factory work and then warehousing for 30 years and never returned to institutional employment. I don't think this was coincidental. You encounter something that operates by rules that don't correspond to any framework you've built, and the reasonable response is to stay out of the situations where you might encounter it again. Young people encounter stories about old asylums, and they think about architecture and sad history and dramatic photography. That is a reasonable response to something you haven't personally witnessed. I don't fault anyone for it. Belief isn't the point. I don't require anyone to believe what I'm writing. The people around Danvers have a name for what they say moves through the area around where Colton State stood. The grounds were cleared in 1961 and the building demolished. They call it the Hollow Patient, though that name may be newer than the thing it describes. If you look at Essex County records going back to the 1840s, before Coloulton was built on that land, before any institutional building existed there, you find scattered accounts from agricultural workers and travelers describing things consistent with what we observed. A figure that watches from a distance and does not respond to being observed. A cold that moves through structures without regard for their construction. Marks on surfaces at heights that do not correspond to ordinary men. Every 15 to 20 years, something is recorded. The intervals are not precise, but they are consistent enough that I notice them. I only know what I witnessed during 42 nights in the winter of 1926. I know a cell door that locked from both sides without human agency. I know a voice that told me things I had not shared with anyone. I know scratch marks on a ceiling 8.5 feet above a stone floor. I know a patient who arrived on a county wagon with an admissions form that someone subsequently removed from a permanent institutional archive. I know Nurse Hollis measuring footprints in a wooden corridor with a steel ruler and not speaking for a long time afterward. Whatever it was patient. It measured. It waited. It left when its work, whatever that work was complete. It was not afraid of us. It was not hostile to us in any personal sense. We were incidental to it. That, I have found, is the most unsettling aspect of the entire experience to sit with across 50 years. Not that it threatened us, that we simply did not matter to it. Dr. Harwick wrote, "Certain measurements warrant continued monitoring," in his first examination record. I think he understood from that first day that something in Cell 7 was changing in ways that his professional framework had no language for. His response was to find language that fit within the framework rather than expand the framework to fit the reality. That is a very human response. I understand it completely. Some things were here before we drew institutional walls around them. Some things use those walls for purposes of their own that we are not equipped to understand or interrupt. The stone always remembers.